From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're going to check on the markets again today because they are selling off yet once again. Return to Abigail Doolittle. So it looks like tech's sort of leading the way, although they're off the lows.
We are off the lows, but it does appear to be a continuation of that intense selling pressure that we saw last week as the mega cap stock simply sold lower and sold lower. So again, a bit of that today. The Nasdaq 100 at this point really leading the declines, down about 3.3%. The S&P 500 down more than 2% at this point. However, David, it's important to recognize here that while we have these big declines, it does not feel panicked. And it's also interesting because the Dow transports are down just 0.7%. So if this had something to do systemic with the economy, you would probably see that truly sensitive to the economy index, the Dow transport, selling off even more than big tech. Rather, this seems to be a continuation of the technical selling in terms of all that frothy action. The Nasdaq 100 between the March lows and the recent peaks just last week, up more than 80%. Some investors taking chips off the table. One difference from last week, though, to keep our eye on, we do have a little bit more of a bid for bonds than we had last week. The 10-year yield down 4 basis points. Of course, price trades inverse to yield. So net, it's a risk-off picture. But again, it does not feel panicked. It seems a bit more orderly, a continuation. And the Nasdaq 100 is holding support, that 50-day moving average. If below that, it could then get disorderly. But right now, orderly selling.
So, Abigail, you like and are so good at the technical aspects. You mentioned the froth that had been in the market when it comes to tech. Do we have any indication whether that's come out so far? Are we closer to defensible valuations than we were?
So relative to valuation, they're still super high on an objective standpoint, although relative to the time period that so many people like to compare it to, 2000, nowhere close to that valuation. Relative to the technicals, it does seem as though the buyers are trying to step in here somewhere, even with the sellers at work. Again, the Nasdaq 100 holding its 50-day moving average. Apple has not yet touched that support line. If that support, those buyers, those near-term buyers who have been so enthusiastic about the markets should fold, then we could see some real selling pressure. But so long as they're in place, we're very likely to see the markets hold up. One area that I'd like to turn to, though, David, super quickly, oil, because tech has been taking all of the spotlight away from oil because last week's worst performer, energy. Today, oil down more than 8%. This is something to keep in mind because from a cross-asset standpoint, it is risk off, but also oil very sensitive to the economy itself. So this might be one sign that investors are a little bit nervous around the economy, but overall, orderly risk off.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Lawmakers return to Washington today with a full agenda and not much time before they head back for campaigning in October. We welcome now Libby Cantrill. She is Pimco Head of Public Policy. Libby, always a pleasure to have you with us. So give us some sense. There are two issues here. One is whether they keep the government going at the end of the month. They have to do something to have that. And the other, of course, is the COVID relief or the stimulus package. How are those two connected?
Yeah, well, good afternoon, David. Nice to be here with you. So in some ways, the deadline to pass a government funding bill for fiscal year 2021, which starts October 1st, was in some ways the last kind of opportunity for members of Congress to come together and try to reconcile some of their big differences around the COVID relief stimulus bill. As you remember, Congress has really stepped up here. They've passed almost $3 trillion worth of spending to address some of the COVID-led downturn in the economy. But most economists think that they need more. They need to do more. And there are some pretty big differences between the two parties. There's also some similarities. There's actually some agreement on some of these things too. So, our view has been that there would likely be a deal, but really we are coming at kind of the last possible moment. And again, this sort of continuing resolution, this funding bill for 2021 was viewed as sort of the last opportunity. So the fact that they've already agreed that they would go and do something without COVID stimulus included does sort of make the chances of a COVID stimulus bill before the election, lower than certainly what we thought.
So, Libby, as you say, economists seem to be almost universal in saying we need more, we need more. At the same time, the hydraulic pressure seems to be reducing, and the economic numbers haven't really driven it up. If you look at the jobs numbers and you look at personal spending, you look at various indicators, we haven't had that fiscal cliff we thought we would have. And so the question really is, do the lawmakers think we really need to have another round of stimulus?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and certainly some of the economic data has been more positive than certainly what many folks had expected. There are some signs, however, that there might be some weakening as we get closer to the election, which of course, David, as you and I both know, I mean, there is a lot of political downside risk if lawmakers don't come to some sort of resolution, and if the economy does start weakening closer to the election. So, and there are sort of some leading indicators that would show that there might be some fragilities in the economy. So, kind of the point here is that there is a chance that when the data kind of catches up here and the market starts pricing in some of the downside risk, it might be too late. Policymakers, to your point earlier, may have already gone home to start campaigning for the November election. So there doesn't seem to be the sense of urgency right now, but that could change very quickly. And if we see kind of a continuation of what we're seeing in the markets today and over the last few days, then that could absolutely change the political calculus, especially on the case of President Trump here. I mean, he does not want to go into re-election. The stock market has been obviously one of his kind of shining data points, and I don't think he wants to go into re-election with a real weakening market. So that again might change the political calculus here pretty quickly.
Libby, as you say, we've got an election November 3rd. Who has more to lose at this stake? Do you think the Republicans or the Democrats if they fall short?
Yeah, I mean, both are going to be in some ways vulnerable, and again, that's one of the reasons why I've sort of been confident that they would pass something, because again, there's so much kind of political downside risk to not doing anything. But you have to think it's the Republicans, right? The Republicans are the ones who control the White House. The Republicans right now control the Senate. So in some ways, they have more to lose than the Democrats. It's not to say the Democrats don't have any downside risk either, because I think I would say they do. But in terms of who has more to lose, it's certainly the Republicans. And as you know, David, especially in the Senate, there are 35 seats up for re-election. Of those 35, 23 seats are being defended by Republicans. So the political map, if you will, for the Senate re-election is much trickier for Republicans. Again, leading one to think that they would come to a resolution because they have more to lose come November.
So Libby, just yesterday, the president had sort of a wide-ranging, if I can call it that, news conference at the White House. One of the things he said is, I'm maybe open to disengaging altogether with China. We're going to start punishing U.S. companies if they're doing things in China they should be doing back here in the United States. What do you make of that? Is that a real change in policy? It's sort of a note that he struck throughout his 3.5 years in office.
It's absolutely a note that he has struck during his entire administration. It's something he ran on in 2016. It's something he's been talking about since the early aughts when China gained accession to the WTO. So in some ways, it's incredibly consistent with his ideology. What that means, however, in practice, especially before the election, is somewhat unclear. Although, I mean, if you look at what this administration is doing, not just what they're saying, but what they're doing as it relates to China, it is taking steps towards decoupling, especially around sensitive technologies, around export controls, things like visa restrictions, travel restrictions. So there is, kind of an incremental decoupling, I think we would argue already happening. And what that means for a second term, especially if President Trump obviously gets reelected, is a big question mark. Does that decoupling only intensify? And yes, you're right. In his wide-ranging press conference, he would seem to signal that yes, it would.
At the same time, how does it register with voters? I mean, voters are not so concerned, I don't think, about China one way or the other. They just want to make sure they have a job, that they can afford the grocery bill, they can afford their rent bill. Do the voters really connect being tough on China with their getting jobs? It hasn't worked so far so well, has it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I think that in some ways China is an easy scapegoat for both political parties in Washington, and in some ways I think it's also registering with voters. Pew Research did a poll this summer that showed that almost 70% of Americans have a negative view on China right now. That's the highest it's ever been, again, since China gained WTO accession in 2001. So in some ways, the voter sentiment has changed around China. I think it makes it difficult for either political party to look like they're cozying up with China as a result. But I think you're right, though. This is not necessarily a kitchen table issue, although China has been kind of the easy scapegoat, at least from a policymaker perspective.
Yeah, as I say, it's always a real treat to have you with us, Libby. That's Libby Cantrill. She is Pimco, head of public policy. Coming up here, getting a grip on the swing state of Arizona through the lens of a single county. Josh Green of Bloomberg Business Week is here with his reporting on a key group of voters. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Karina Mitchell for Bloomberg First Word News.
Okay, David, thank you. Bloomberg has learned that Donald Trump is considering an unprecedented step for an incumbent president. He's discussed spending as much as $100 million of his own money to win the election. The president has been scrutinizing heavy spending by his team earlier this year that failed to push him ahead of Joe Biden. Plus, Biden's campaign and other Democratic entities have outraised the Trump campaign in recent months. Meanwhile, government and private industry officials are taking steps to make sure the White House doesn't interfere with the process of approving a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine. Bloomberg has learned that the Food and Drug Administration is making sure its staff knows that politics shouldn't influence the agency's decisions. FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn tweeted today that there will be no cutting corners when it comes to approving a vaccine. 2 weeks ago, President Trump made the unsubstantiated claim that the, quote, deep state was slowing approval of a vaccine. And India and China are accusing each other of making provocative military moves and firing warning shots along their disputed border, despite talks on ending the escalating tensions. The nuclear-armed rivals have been engaged in a tense standoff in the region since May. In a symbolic move, India has banned scores of Chinese-owned apps, including TikTok, citing privacy concerns that it says pose a threat to India's sovereignty and security. And Japan is moving forward with preparations for Tokyo Olympics to be held next year, even though there is no clear sign the COVID-19 pandemic will be under control by that time. International Olympic Committee Vice President John Coates reignited the debate over whether the Games would be held next summer after he said they'll go ahead next year regardless of the coronavirus situation. The Olympics were scheduled to be held this summer, but were pushed back a year due to the pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Karina. Arizona has voted for a Republican for president in every election since 1952, except once. That was when Bill Clinton ran for re-election in 1996. But the color of the state seems to be changing, and a key component of that change is Maricopa County, which includes the suburbs of Phoenix. Josh Green, Bloomberg Business Week national correspondent, has taken an in-depth look at the county. It's in the current issue of Bloomberg Business Week, and we welcome him now. Josh, great to have you with us. Fascinating, in-depth piece here. First of all, tell us about Maricopa County, because I learned things from your piece I didn't realize how big it is, for one thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we picked Maricopa County because it is a hugely suburban county. It's the county that encompasses Phoenix and all the surrounding suburbs. And Arizona overall is a very suburban state. Most of the population is in Maricopa County, so whoever wins that county tends to win the state. And what made it interesting to us was that the suburbs like Maricopa County, have really emerged during the Trump years as the frontier of U.S. politics. This is where the battle for the White House and probably the battle for the Senate are going to be decided. So I did a deep dive in Maricopa, looking at the two trends that have been driving a pretty striking change from a county that was once all red and known for its very strong anti-immigrant views to one that is now swinging quite strikingly toward Democrats and Joe Biden.
And how much of that, Josh, is because people are changing their minds, and how much of it is actually a demographic change in the suburbs? Because as you point in your piece, we have a tendency to think that suburbs are overwhelmingly white Americans living there. Not so much the case anymore.
You know, that's a great question, and the answer is both. Maricopa is interesting because, in the early 2000s, it was the fastest growing county in America, and a lot of that was driven by rapid diversification. So influx, not just of Latinos, but of Asians, Pacific Islanders. So it's very much a multicultural type of suburb, which is emblematic of the suburbs across the country. A lot of people, when they hear suburbs, they imagine these kind of lily white, wealthy enclaves like Greenwich, Connecticut, that may have described the suburbs, 40, 50 years ago, but no longer represent the suburbs of today, which are much more heavily Black, Latino. They encompass rich, poor, and middle class. They look much more like the rest of America. Certainly, Maricopa is a good example of that. But the really striking change in Maricopa, political change, has come in attitudes among white professional voters, lawyers, bankers, engineers, finance people. What we've seen is that their views have shifted over the last 10 years away from the Republican Party and toward the Democratic Party, so long as it's represented by folks like Joe Biden rather than someone like Bernie Sanders.
So, as far as you can tell, what are the things in Maricopa County that people are really concerned about? What's going to drive voters this year?
Well, I sat in on a bunch of focus groups of undecided voters in Maricopa County, and by far the overwhelming issue was President Trump's handling of COVID. These voters were deeply, deeply unhappy. Many of them were also skeptical of Democrats and Joe Biden, but my big takeaway is this is going to be the deciding issue in the race. A secondary issue to a lot of them was the issue of immigration and the way the Republican Party has really swung pretty far to the right. Arizona is interesting because they essentially were where our country was at about 10 years ago. On the immigration front, they, of course, elected Joe Arpaio, the notorious sheriff of Maricopa County, very anti-immigrant, served there for 24 years, and went through this process on immigration that the country as a whole has under Trump. Initially, people were very supportive of Republican efforts to curb illegal immigration and crack down hard, but eventually that became alienating to this professional class in the Maricopa County suburbs. They ousted Arpaio in 2016, the same year they elected Trump, and now what we're seeing in the poll numbers is that they are moving against Trump and that brand of Republican politics. So that is certainly a warning sign for Trump and Republicans who need to win the state of Arizona, I think, if they're going to have a realistic chance of holding on to the White House. And right now, polls show Biden up narrowly.
So, Josh, if the number one issue was COVID-19 and the handling of COVID-19, could you tell, is that a concern about physical safety of themselves, their loved ones, or is it the economic consequences of having to shut down?
My impression, and again, this is somewhat subjective because these are just a handful of voter groups, was it was much more an issue of physical safety, but beyond that, the sense that there was really no plan, there was really nobody in control, and that it wasn't science and safety that was driving the state's response and Trump's response, that it was political. And a lot of these folks in these focus groups who had voted for Trump in 2016 were very upset that a better job wasn't being done handling the crisis. So that certainly left many of them open to making a change, both in the Senate. Arizona has a key Senate race this year, but especially in the presidential race with President Trump.
Do we have any sense of the extent to which what you saw in Maricopa County might apply in other, particularly battleground states around the country, or are they all sui generis?
It's interesting. I mean, I think of Maricopa as being at the kind of the vanguard of a group of similar type suburbs across the country. And these are fast-growing, traditionally Republican metro areas like Atlanta, Dallas, Denver, Houston. We're seeing the same changes with the same groups of voters in all of these suburbs. And so that's why I think Maricopa might be a canary in the coal mine here, and why you could see evidence of this shift from red to blue, even in the 2018 midterm elections, where House Democrats made huge gains, many of them by ousting former Republican members from these suburban districts.
We heard President Trump at the convention make what some of us thought was maybe a pitch to the suburbs, saying, watch out, they're going to take your suburbs away from you. They actually said the Democrats are out to destroy the suburbs, based largely on the law and order claim. Is that resonating at all?
I think it is somewhat. I mean, clearly Trump recognizes the importance of the suburbs, and his strategy is to try and frighten those voters, have them think about their safety, their property values. He spent a lot of time on Twitter, talking about this stuff, lobbying charges against Biden and the Democrats. I didn't get the sense from the people that I talked to that that was the foremost concern. It was clearly COVID, but there was trepidation watching some of these violent protests unfold in other cities. And it was at least causing these voters to pause and think about who they might want to vote for. Whether or not that's enough to save Trump in Maricopa and Arizona, we'll see. I'm a little skeptical based on the reporting that I've done, but clearly that is Trump's gambit heading into the fall, that he's going to try and keep these suburban voters by striking a note of fear that will, he hopes, keep them in his fold.
Okay, Josh, that was really terrific reporting. Appreciate it greatly. That is Bloomberg Opinion's Josh Green, and you can catch his reporting in the current issue of Bloomberg Business Week. Still ahead here, we're going to have an exclusive interview with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Her thoughts on how she could get a stimulus bill through Congress with the little time left. Much more coming up also on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. It is time now for the stock of the hour. Shares of Tesla are continuing to decline after the company was left out of the S&P 500, and competitor Nikola today announced a deal with GM. Scarlett Fu is here taking a look at that action.
That's right, David. Tesla taking a 1-2 punch on those negative headlines. At one point, the stock tumbled as much as 20%, its biggest one-day drop ever. It is now down 30% in September. But don't get too upset for Tesla shareholders. It is still the second best performer in the NASDAQ 100. After Zoom, it is still up more than 300%. Now, the prevailing consensus was that S&P 500 inclusion was in the bag. We've seen Tesla run up 56% since late July, when its results capped 4 straight quarters of profit, which we know was a prerequisite for being included in the S&P. Now, retail investors in particular banked on being able to sell to passive funds that would have to buy Tesla once the stock was added. Here's the other thing. We've also learned that a slew of bullish options trades also magnified Tesla's gains in recent weeks. Now, this move is catching a lot of options traders off sides because most of the September call options are now out of the money, and that means the underlying price is below the strike price. The monthly contracts expire September 18th, so there is still time for Tesla to mount a comeback, and given how volatile it's been in the past, that could very well be the case. Something else we learned of, Tesla definitely capitalized on its monster August. It had a 74% surge. It split its stock 5-for-1. It sold $5 billion of shares to raise cash from September 1st to September 4th. So that added some pressure to the recent decline. The official reason was to strengthen its balance sheet. We know that Tesla faces a more competitive landscape. As you mentioned, General Motors is investing $2 billion in Nikola. It'll partner with the EV truck maker to make its Badger pickup. We'll get more details on all of that from Nikola's founder and chairman, Trevor Milton, in the 2 p.m. hour. David?
Okay, thank you so much to Bloomberg Scarlett Fu. Coming up here, an exclusive talk with the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We welcome now the Speaker of the House of the Representatives. She is Nancy Pelosi, of course. Madam Speaker, thank you for spending time with us. You've made no secret of the fact that you think we need a substantial fiscal stimulus. You have the HEROES Act that's been there for over 3 months now, I think, without real action from the Senate side. Do we still need it as badly? Because the economic numbers have been coming in not as badly as some people predicted. Did we really have a fiscal cliff that we stepped off of?
Yes, we have tens of millions of people who are unemployed in our country, and whatever the analysis is of some, for them at their kitchen table, we need a stimulus. We need a stimulus in terms of job creation. We need money to invest in ending. This is just the mystery to me, why this administration has refused to invest in crushing the virus. Because only in doing that are we able to open the economy and open our schools safely. We need funding for keeping people from being evicted. We need food security funding and the rest. And all of this is stimulus. Food stamps are stimulus. Unemployment insurance benefits are stimulus to the economy. So while they are stabilizers, they're also stimulus.
So if that's the case, why aren't people across the way in the Senate, and particularly across the aisle, getting that message? Because they don't seem to be very inclined to come to the table and get something done.
Well, I don't know why they don't, because the chairman of the Fed and other Fed leaders around the country have said very clearly that we need a stimulus, that we need a boost. They've even referenced that state and local governments' fiscal soundness is important to the soundness of our economy. And in not supporting state and local government, people will be put out of their jobs. They'll go on unemployment insurance. What good is that? Why would we want to deprive the American people of the services they deserve? Why wouldn't we honor our heroes, healthcare as well as food, teachers, transportation, sanitation, our first responders? Why would we want them to risk their lives to save lives so they could lose their jobs? Because there are just some in the Senate, on the Republican side of the aisle, who said they don't want to spend one more dollar. Imagine, they don't want to spend one more dollar to crush the virus, to open our economy by crushing that virus, to support our state governments, and putting money in the pockets of the American people.
And Madam Speaker, that leads me exactly to the question, is there a deal, even though you might not want to take the deal, is there any deal you could take it off from the Republicans? I mean, you and the minority leader, Chuck Schumer, said today it's an emaciated bill. Is there a bill at all even for an emaciated bill? Because as you said, some people say not $1.
Well, what Senator McConnell put forth is fraudulent. It is, as Leader Schumer said, emaciated. It's not, they call it a skinny bill, and he calls it an emaciated bill, and I join him in that. It's only a check the box so that some of his endangered Republican senators can go home and say, well, see, I tried. But it isn't trying. It's not even an attempt to do the right thing. And Mitch McConnell knows that because he has to satisfy those Republicans in his caucus who don't want to spend one more dollar, whether it's feeding the food insecure children in our country, saving their families from eviction, stopping the dismantling of the Postal Service so that people can vote without risking their health, again, first and foremost, crushing the virus and putting money into the pockets of the American people. What they have is so meager that it insults the intelligence of the American people, does not solve the problem, and it is not. Again, we know that we have to compromise. We know we have to negotiate in order to reach an agreement. We all want an agreement. Make no mistake about that. But get serious, get real, Mitch McConnell.
Well, let's talk about what...
He paused. He pushed the pause. Remember, May 15th, when we passed our bill, he pushed the pause button. It wasn't until the last few weeks that he's now even coming up with a suggestion. In that time, nearly 5 million more people have become infected since he pushed the pause button, and nearly over 100,000 people have died.
So talk about what it means to get serious. And I guess part of my question is, get serious with whom? Is it Senator McConnell that you're negotiating with? Is it Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin? Is it Mark Meadows up at the White House? Who's on the other side of the negotiating table from you to get to a deal?
Well, certainly not Mark Meadows. But in terms of the negotiation, the Republicans have to negotiate among themselves. Mitch McConnell has this pathetic bill, which is half of what the Secretary Mnuchin has proposed. So they aren't even in agreement. They are in disarray. We have said we would come down. First, we came down $1 trillion. Then we came down and further and said we would meet them halfway. And some of that is because we can put off the timing of some of ours. We're not being Sophie's choice by saying we're feeding some children and not others. It's about timing, and we can have that negotiation. But to ignore those needs, how could they ignore the virus and the spread of it and the cost to our economy, our education system, and the rest? So two of the sticking points for us are state and local government, which, by the way, not only meets many needs of the American people, but provides over 90% of the public education system in our country, meeting our education needs. And then further money that is needed, coronavirus-centric in terms of education, we're probably double what they want to do. And of course, the funding for crushing the virus. There would be three areas where we're pretty far apart.
Madam Speaker, on the state and local assistance particularly, you know what the arguments on the other side. They don't want the money to go for things like what they would call bloated pension plans. Are you willing to attach restrictions that say it really goes for things specifically related to COVID-19?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say those are reasons that they're not doing it. I think those are excuses because they don't believe in governance. They don't believe in science, therefore they haven't gone with the testing, tracing, treatment, isolation, mask wearing, etc. They don't believe in science, and they don't believe in governance. So there is this money for that we wanted state and local government is for a very specific coronavirus-centric purpose, to offset some of the expenses that have already, the outlays that have already been made to fight the virus and meet the needs, the health needs of people infected, and secondly, to talk about the loss of revenue because of the shutdowns around the country. That, again, having that in there will prevent further firing. People will have to be let off from work, and then they'll go on unemployment insurance. So where have you saved money by reducing services to the American people and having state governments are telling us we're going to have to raise taxes, fire people, and reduce services unless we get this resources. So what the Republicans are saying is really quite sad, because they know that this money is corona-centric, and you have to document the need in order to get the money.
Madam Speaker, as you describe this, I'm not sure how you get there from here, given the process you've described, because it's not clear exactly with whom you're negotiating or that they have anything that they can negotiate, because some of their members don't want to spend any money at all. How do we get there, particularly given the fact that you're going to have to go on recess to get back to campaign back in home districts pretty soon?
Well, we'll be here for the month of September at least, or as long as it takes. We have to make sure that government is not shut down. As the president so proudly announced, he would take pride in shutting down the government the last time it was shut down. So we'll come to agreement on that, I feel quite certain. We have other initiatives that we need to put forward, and some of them go directly to making sure that the American people, that we are, again, making the scientific decision to crush the virus, to honor our heroes with state and local resources, and putting money in the pockets of the American people, and at the same time ensuring that people are able to vote without risking their life or their health, so that they can vote safely. Ignoring what the president is saying about vote by mail, which he does, and instead having confidence that their vote will be counted as cast. So we have a tall order to address here. And if you don't believe in science, as they obviously do not, and you don't believe in governance, as many of them do not, they don't want to even spend any money to honor the science, then there's a strong difference of opinion. And we cannot, we will find agreement, I know we will, but in order for that to happen, they're going to have to come to their own agreement instead of being hundreds of billions of dollars apart between what Mitch McConnell is doing and what Secretary Mnuchin has suggested.
Speaker Pelosi, you referred to the possibility of shutting down the government. There have been reports that you and Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin have more or less agreed on a way to keep it going, presumably with a continuing resolution. Why are you so confident? Because it has been the case in the past that President Trump, even though we thought we had a deal, basically changes his mind and shuts down the government. Why are you confident that President Trump won't do that this time?
Well, you're never confident about the president when you're talking about veracity or truth. That's why it's a waste of time to even listen to what he says. But the fact is that we did not come to an agreement. We separately acknowledged that it would be important for us to have a clean, continuing resolution, that they would not be heaping things on there that would be unacceptable from one side or the other. And so it only makes sense to do that, and I feel quite certain that we will get that done. And if the president chooses to veto a continuing resolution, I would find it hard for him to do that. But who knows? The Republicans in Congress have never stood in the way to any of his grotesque behavior, so I don't know why they would start now. But nonetheless, I think that it's not in anybody's interest for a government to be shut down. It is to be avoided at all costs. And we have many times swallowed bitter pills in order to keep government open because it's essential to do so.
Madam Speaker, we've talked before about this election, not so much about who wins or loses, but about how we make sure that we protect the integrity of the election, that we believe in what the results are that come out. You, of course, have proposed some supplemental funding for the United States Postal Service. What can we do, you do, we do, to make sure that whoever wins or loses November 3rd or thereafter, because it may take longer than that to really know who it is, that we all as a nation can believe in the integrity of the process?
Well, this is essential because we are a democracy and we need to respect the results of an election, whoever wins. There are other players in here, actors, bad actors like the Russians, who would like to dim the glow of democracy as helping them in their own country, but they're doing this in other countries in the world. They're trying to jeopardize the integrity of elections to undermine the effectiveness of democracy. The president welcomes their intervention. That's most unfortunate. In fact, in many cases, not even legal. So what we have to do is to say, join together and just say the American people should decide who the next president of the United States is, not Vladimir Putin. So that's one. And then for them to dismantle the postal system so as to impede the ability of votes to be expeditiously received, the ballots received and then returned in a timely fashion, has to be, a bright light has to be shown on that so that the American people know. It's probably going to happen, so you better vote early, but only once, not illegally as the president has suggested more than one time. So we just have to, again, ensure the integrity of the election, not by assuming it, by in some ways legislating it, by Republican and Democratic secretaries of state around the country have asked for more funding so that they can implement the increased voting that they will see. Some of it will be by mail, some of it will be in separating because of the coronavirus. It is a reality, whether you're voting by mail to avoid going to a polling place or whether you just culturally want to go to the polling place, but that there will be spatial distancing, and that may require more polling places, more hours, more days, and that takes more money. And that's what we have in the HEROES Act, and we're hoping that the Republicans will agree that the health of our democracy and the health of the American people warrants. It's a small amount of money, a small price to pay for our democracy.
Finally, Madam Speaker, do you believe that the Democrats are prepared for what could be a very nasty election? Let's be frank. We have heard some things out of the Trump campaign that are quite personal. I mean, you've even been subject to it with that hair salon business out in San Francisco. Is Joe Biden, are the other Democrats prepared for something that could really get almost petty? And how do you respond to things like that?
Well, you know, you have to take the high road in all of this. One thing I learned growing up in politics, you can't become them. If that's how they want to conduct themselves, that's their problem. But we set a higher standard for how we go forward. The American people are craving a vision about how they can have economic security and health security and good education for their children and preserving this planet, which of course, if you're in denial about science, which this administration is, then you reject the science to say that the planet is in jeopardy. But people care about that, and young people care very much about that as well. So people don't want to hear the pettiness and the back and forth. They want to know, what does it mean? How does it connect to them? Their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, their fears, their concerns that they have about the future. The elections are always about the future, and that's where we have to take the discussion. I'm so proud of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That ticket is going to take us into the future in a very values-based, respectful of other people's views, seeking common ground where we can find it, standing our ground for America's working families. As we come out of this Labor Day weekend, we can honestly say, they'll say what they'll say. We don't agonize, we organize. And in many cases, we unionize to benefit America's working families.
Okay, Madam Speaker, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. That is Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you, David.
Good to see you, ma'am. Coming up, the role of historically black colleges and universities in training the next generation of doctors. We talk with the head of Howard University, Dr. Wayne Frederick. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Last week, Bloomberg Philanthropies announced an historic gift of $100 million to 4 historically black medical schools, including that of Howard University. Michael R. Bloomberg is the founder not only of Bloomberg Philanthropies, but also of our parent company, Bloomberg LP. We don't regularly cover his activities, but this is a news story with much larger ramifications. And to take us through those ramifications, welcome now Howard University President, Dr. Wayne Frederick. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being here. Give us a sense of the larger set of issues here with educating African-American black doctors.
Yeah, well, it's very important. African-American doctors have been shown to be more culturally competent for treating African-American patients. And as a result, there have been studies that have shown that healthcare outcomes in that community is better when African-American doctors are there. The largest barrier to having more African-American doctors is still finances. The pipeline, obviously, from K through 12 and then in undergrad is one that has to be addressed, but certainly finances is an issue. And then on the flip side of that, what decisions do African-American physicians make once they graduate in terms of what specialties they get into? And that can be influenced by their debt as well. And so when you look at the dearth of primary care physicians, or you look at the dearth of certain specialists as well, some of it is actually linked to the fact that they graduated more debt as well. So this is an amazing gift that can be absolutely transformative for this issue.
And can you give us some sense of the degree of underrepresentation of black doctors among the larger physicians population?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at 1978, there were more African-American males who applied to medical school than this year. About 3% of the folks getting into medical school and matriculating are African-Americans, so significantly underrepresented when you think of the proportion of our society. And then when you look at our medical schools and you look at the full professor ranks, less than 1% of the full professors at our nation's medical schools are actually African-American. And so significant underrepresentation throughout the entire system.
Give us some sense of what this gift from Bloomberg Philanthropies will do in terms of really supporting students and how much more is needed.
Yeah, sure. This gift will result in each student who's currently enrolled at Howard University, who is from an underrepresented minority classification and is receiving financial aid, will get $100,000 towards their tuition. And in the case of seniors, while they'll get $25,000 towards their tuition for this year, they'll get another $75,000 towards any debt they may have accrued in the prior years. So it absolutely will be a significant gift. Here at Howard, it's the largest single gift given to our medical school in its history. And it will amount to about $32.8 million. The gift also includes funds to afford wraparound services to support these students as well. And yes, going forward, if we can make this tuition for Howard University students free, that's a significant, that again would take a significant investment, well over $1 billion, but that can actually in perpetuity result in the support of African-American students at Howard without tuition. And that also, again, would be a continuation of what this catalytic gift has started.
Dr. Frederick, philanthropy sometimes loves company. Is it hoped that this might actually lead other people to make similar sorts of gifts to get to that, for example, $1 billion number that you just gave us?
Yeah, absolutely. Most certainly. We would love to see more people step up and support. And we've been continuing to see that as people see the results of what our medical schools do and just see the major impact it could have on the nation's overall health. Because remember, as African Americans have worse health outcomes, we actually spend more money as a result of having to treat people with late-stage disease. And if we can put more of that into prevention, what we spend as a percentage of our GDP would actually decrease. And so this is actually in everybody's interest in the nation to see more Black doctors out there so that they can improve the overall health of the nation as well.
Dr. Frederick, we recently watched the Republican convention, and we heard a lot about efforts that the Trump administration has made to help historically Black colleges and universities, such as Howard, for example. And in reading up on it, it appears that they actually have done quite a bit. What is your experience in dealing with the Trump administration in support for your institution and others similar to it?
Yeah, the numbers speak for themselves. There definitely has been an increase in support for HBCUs, but we've been to the mat to do that. And also these bills are generated in Congress. The Trump administration has been supportive of them, certainly hasn't blocked any of that activity, but we've been out lobbying all of the members of Congress and all of the senators to make the case that our institutions matter and that they have a significant return on investment that they've given the country. And that's seen in many different places. If you look at 80% of the Black judges in this country, you look at the Congress, who's in Congress and where they went to school. You look at just about every field and industry in this country, and you see the product of these HBCUs. And so rightly so, there has been some increased investment that we hope will continue after the election as well.
Including the current nominee for Vice President of the United States from the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, is a proud graduate of Howard University as well. You have had such a historic role in race relations in this country, Howard University, the institution, as you read through the civil rights movement. What do you make of what's going on in the country right now and the racial divisions?
Yeah, Howard University has been on a journey to social justice for 153 years. And what has been going on in the country of late is that some of these things have bubbled to the surface. And we recognize that more people have joined that caravan as a result of what we're able to see on our television sets and in our communities. And we welcome that. But I also remain concerned that those people will eventually leave the caravan as they did after the civil rights, the main part of the civil rights movement. And so institutions like Howard will be here until we get to that ultimate destination. We will do the work that's necessary. And so what's going on in the country, I think, has been occurring all along, but has been beneath the surface of our consciousness. And it has now been raised and elevated so that we all have to hopefully address it and continue to address it until it's solved.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really terrific to have you with us. Greatly appreciate it. That's Dr. Wayne Frederick. He is the president of Howard University, one of the recipients of this major gift to support medical students. In the meantime, we'll just check on the markets briefly here. They are down again today, although off the lows, and led once again by NASDAQ and those tech stocks. There's been yet a further sell-off in tech stocks. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue it over on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to Maddie Duppler. She's senior fellow at the National Taxpayers Union. There are conflicting reports on what's going to happen with taxes. We have a Joe Biden saying, let's raise them, or President Trump saying, let's cut them. We're going to talk with Maddie about that. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.